Welcome to Hawthorne Valley's podcast, Roots to Renewal. I'm the producer and Hawthorne Valley's marketing director, Heather Gibbons. We started this podcast more than a year ago as a way to celebrate Hawthorne Valley's 50th anniversary and share our story by engaging in conversation with friends, both near and far, who dedicate their lives to meeting the ecological, social, and spiritual needs of our time. With this episode, we're excited to officially launch Season 2 of the podcast, and we are thrilled to have Greg Watson as our guest to kick things off. Greg is the Director of Policy and Systems Design at the Schumacher Center for Renewal Economics and a self-described lifelong student. He has spent nearly 50 years studying systems thinking as inspired by Buckminster Fuller and has worked to apply that understanding to achieve a more just and sustainable world. In this episode, you'll hear more about Greg's amazing biography and his involvement in many future-bearing and life-bearing initiatives, as he and Hawthorne Valley's Executive Director and podcast host, Martin Ping, take a deep dive on the topics of systems thinking and new economics, creating new forms of cooperation, the wisdom of nature, and so much more. We'd like to express our gratitude to Tierra Farm, a family-owned manufacturer and distributor of organic dried fruits and nuts that puts the people they serve and the planet we share before all else, for their continued generous support of this podcast. Learn more at tierrafarm.org. With that, let's dive in.
Good morning, Greg. It is such a great pleasure to be able to spend some time with you this morning. Your life is quite full. I know this because we're engaged in some other things together at the moment, and having you find any time to have a conversation is much appreciated, not lost on me, the kind of commitment that takes. So thank you. Currently, you're Director of Policy and Systems at Schumacher Center for New Economics, correct?
Correct. Systems design, yes.
Systems design. The term new economics might mean different things to different people. How would you describe the key elements of a new economy?
I think the new economics is a response to sort of the conventional approach that many feel that it's sort of been necessary to bring prosperity to great masses of people. The interesting thing about new economics and the Schumacher Center is sort of the distinction between growth and development. We all know that growth cannot continue. The Earth has been around for 4 billion years. It's developed, but it hasn't grown in size, and it's been resilient and sustainable. So that's part of it. The other part of it is it's decentralized, which means that the decisions, many of the most important decisions that affect people's lives, can be made at the local level. They do not have to come from sort of upon high with government. And that sort of large decentralized or centralized approach, I think, feeds into sort of the notion of bigger is better. You know, you think back to the days of Earl Butz, the secretary, I do at least, Secretary of Agriculture in the Nixon administration, who declared that you've got to be big or get out. People up to that point assumed that small family farms were uneconomical, and there was something inherently uneconomical about the small farms. It was a decision that was made by that administration, not that administration alone, but it was a decision that was made in part driven by policy that says, we want you to be big. If you're not big, you're going to get out. And we will then design our programs and our subsidies to support that approach. So new economics says, whoa, how do we step back from that? How do we empower local communities to understand their ability to gain some measure of control, in many cases, a large measure of control over meeting their basic needs and beyond?
So Schumacher Center, and maybe it's good to just give a nod to E.F. Schumacher, whose seminal work came out, I think it was published in 1973, if I'm not mistaken, which is...
Yes, because our 50th anniversary is next, yes.
Yeah, so we're celebrating our 50th, and I'm just so interested in that general time period, and I think a lot of our conversation will touch on that, because a lot of the work that you've been involved in is also, you know, kind of coming out of, a lot of it was born in that era, coming out of that era. But I'm curious, when did you first encounter Schumacher's work?
Right around that time, actually. I was a child of the 60s. I graduated from high school in 1967, grew up in Cleveland, Ohio. And I tell people, growing up in Cleveland, Ohio, I grew up on the banks of Lake Erie and the Cuyahoga River. Lake Erie was eutrophied, biologically dead. You couldn't fish. You couldn't eat fish from the lake. The Cuyahoga River, I don't know if you know, made infamous by Randy Newman in his song "Burn On Big River," but it was true. It was so polluted with flammable liquids that a cigarette butt, tossed overboard could result in the surface of the lake erupting, mostly in smoke, but also flames. So I was absolutely aware of the importance of the environment, even as an African American growing up in a city like Cleveland. So I embraced this whole idea, and this was, all around the time right before. It was actually pretty much right before the big Earth Day event, but nonetheless, the environmental movement was in swing. I left Cleveland to attend Tufts University, and I wore my environmental sort of badge on my sleeve, very visible, and was surprised to be confronted by my colleagues at in the Tufts chapter of the Afro-American Society, who questioned my sort of commitment to the environment. And I was taken aback. I mean, first time I've been away from home, I go to college, and I thought this would be a place where I was going to sort of be able to sort of nurture these ideas and concepts. But they challenged me on the notion that, Greg, listen, and this really hurt me. They said we would be not so disturbed if the environmental movement was merely, and this was the term Charlie Jordan, president of the Afro-American Society, said to me, if it was merely irrelevant to our cause, Black Americans. But it's worse than that. They felt that the environmental movement was a sinister movement, that it actually was counter the goals of African Americans. I said, well, what do you mean? And he said, well, listen to the slogans, Greg. No growth, limited growth. We're hearing that now. Where do Black Americans, what are the options for us to achieve economic equality within that scenario? It seems like the status quo remains where they are, and the haves will continue to have, and the have-nots have no pathway to prosperity. And I had an intuitive sense that the twin goals of economic equality and environmental equality were compatible, but I didn't have an intellectual response. And so what happened was I went underground. I discovered the Whole Earth Catalog, and I started to dig and read. And that was in the early 70s. And then as a result, I first came across Buckminster Fuller, and then that led me to this incredible network of people: Wendell Berry, E.F. Schumacher, Hazel Henderson. It was that dilemma, that intellectual sort of dilemma that I find myself in, trying to reconcile those two goals that I felt were important, but at that stage of my life seemed to be incompatible.
And now more and more people are becoming aware of how integral they are, I would say. Would you think? I
think so. As more and more people do gain that awareness, the powers that be become a bit more entrenched and a bit more threatened. So it is still a bit of a struggle, still a bit of organizing, a lot of organizing that has to be done. But I think you're absolutely right, Martin, especially those who have understood how we needed to change our way of thinking and seeing the world, and the whole idea of systems thinking, which again emerged, I would say, for the most part, from the Whole Earth Catalog, right? I mean, Stuart Brand, it was systems thinking that was a driver. And he actually credits Bucky, among others, as being among those who were responsible for the creation of this new way of thinking, new way of operating. And that first catalog was sort of the compendium of on-the-ground work that was being done to achieve the goals of integrating those two important goals.
Well, I hope that it can continue to find more harmony. It's the change in thinking. You've nailed it by saying that, and much of the design work that's been done, that's created the systems we're in, comes much more from a reductive and mechanistic view of the world. And I think that we're beginning to acknowledge nature in her 3.8 billion years of experience and wisdom has a different course that we could look to follow.
Well, that's our model, right? I mean, the Earth has, as you say, for nearly 4 billion years, it has been resilient, and it has developed, right, by rearranging the parts and adapting. In many cases, there are some tough lessons, and there are some things that we have to realize. I mean, part of that is that in that course of the Earth's history, species have come and gone, right? Niches, I mean, we've accelerated some of that, but niches are created by certain species, and the species living in those and those niches actually make it almost inhospitable for that species to continue. So the niche closes, but new species emerge. And it sort of suggests one important concept, critically important, is the Gaia hypothesis. The goal of Gaia, the Earth as a living organism, is to maintain the conditions necessary for life, with no particular species sort of being, with one exception. And this is where you get into these really interesting discussions. That is humans. I mean, in humans, by bent of our minds and our ability to discern nature's strategy. I say strategy, that may be a little too anthropomorphic, but how nature actually maintains those conditions necessary for life are discernible by us. One of the responsibilities that we have to assume is become co-pilots with Gaia in the process of planetary evolution. And that is unique. So our role is not to be passive and hands off and everything, but it's also not to dominate, is to say, where is that in between place? How do we become conscious participants in the planet's evolution?
I think it was Thomas Berry, maybe others, but I remember Thomas saying, the human being is the universe become conscious of itself.
Yes.
And it's a beautiful image to work from, but also one that implies an immense amount of responsibility on us as a species to learn from the wisdom of the universe of which we are a part. The cues are all there in the systems thinking that you've pursued for and been studying for 50 years. It's the patterns, if you will,
That's exactly right.
Are implied. We could mimic, to use another term, Janine Benyus and biomimicry, we can mimic those patterns. Essentially, we are those patterns. So just owning that truth and living into it very deeply would allow us to, I think, recognize the patterns and participate in them in a much healthier and more balanced way than we currently are.
And you're absolutely right. And pattern recognition is a form of mathematics. It's a qualitative form. We've been transfixed with the type of mathematics that quantifies everything, right? And that became sort of the ruler and the master over validity, right? Verify it with numbers. And what you alluded to and what became sort of an obsession with Bucky was, the importance of numbers is how they come together. It's the patterns they form. And Gregory Bateson, right? The patterns which connect. They describe shape and systems and patterns that you can see repeated and that are scalable. The spirals in a nautilus shell, in a hurricane, or in a galaxy. Those patterns persist, and there's a reason why they are there. Can we actually apply those patterns to developing human support systems and increasing life support on the planet, as opposed to technology to do just the opposite, right? They destroy, they undermine the planet's integrity and our ability to support life. Bucky Fuller often said that real wealth is increasing life support. That's what we're here to do, is to expand on a limited planet, on a finite planet, but you can increase life support through the kind of resilient technologies that so many of the folks that you and I have had the honor and pleasure to work with are practicing.
Did you work directly with Bucky in the early years?
No, never. The only time I met Bucky twice. Bucky was for me osmosis, and I will say and I don't know that many people. He changed my life. I mean, I was, I don't know if you know this, but I was peddling a comic strip in New York City in 1974. That's what I thought I was going to do, because I'm thinking about the world differently. I must be wrong, because the world can't be that the world is wrong and I'm right. So I'm going to figure out what's the best way for me to communicate my ideas and concepts and thoughts. So I developed a comic strip that I was influenced by Pogo. I don't know if you remember Pogo.
Oh, yeah.
He had Walt Kelly, and he was Okefenokee Swamps. So I was peddling a comic strip in 1974. I had read Bucky and others before that and was kind of getting, it was kind of forming. But in 1975, he published Synergetics, Explorations in the Geometry of Thinking, his seminal work. And it was just, boom, kind of blew me away. That was sort of putting it all together, and it sort of reaffirmed for me, maybe not others, but okay, I'm now definitely going to stay on this path, because there's something that is truly revolutionary in this approach to thinking.
And did that then lead you to New Alchemy Institute, or when did you?
it led me, interesting enough, first to community organizing, because it was sort of, the whole idea of synergy, the whole being not being able to predict the whole by looking at its parts in isolation. The whole, in many cases, can be greater than the sum of its parts if they're organized right. And Bucky talked about this concept of synergy, which he felt and was convinced is pervasive in the universe. It's ubiquitous, but it's also somewhat invisible, unless you're looking for it. Bucky was big on making the invisible visible. And one of the concepts that he just used to explain synergy was that there's this gas that we all sort of assume is there, oxygen, a gas, hydrogen, a gas. Nothing in the properties of hydrogen or oxygen alone gives you any indication that when combined in the right proportions, you get water. Water is unpredicted by looking at hydrogen and oxygen alone. And then, boom, you do get, so what he sort of said was, if we continue to operate the way conventional education is guiding us, that is, taking the world apart, analyzing, but never putting it back together again, so that you can then sort of experience and understand synergy, which is just sort of, again, ubiquitous. And it's the way that nature does more with less. That whole concept of more with less was the way I began to crawl out of that conundrum between economic equality and environmental quality. Can we do more with less so that we can bring prosperity to more and more people, but using less and less resources to do it? So community organizing was, I kind of fell into it, but the philosophy and the approach that of the systems thinking, where you start to sort of bring disparate people together to achieve a goal, people that you might not normally pull together, but you realize, ooh, this could create the kind of synergy that could help us achieve the goals. And that first community organizing effort for me was the Boston Urban Gardeners. This was in the city of Boston, and we organized community gardens for people that didn't have access to a backyard or whatever, and realized how empowering it was, not just for gardens, but for the people that were engaged in it. One of the most empowering feelings I think people can have is, I am now able to meet some of my basic needs. I mean, what's more basic than food, right? And I'm in the city and I can grow it. But we need to do this together because we need resources. We need political clout, social. That was sort of my initial foray into sort of what I think I am more than anything else, and that is an organizer.
And that's beautiful, because we're trying to organize ourselves around these certain principles that you've keyed into by paying attention and being open to studying them, and then being able to bring them to apply them to human systems and social systems. You said something early that just made me think of like what you're doing as social alchemy when we talk about the New Alchemy Institute, but you're involved in this social alchemy where you're just bringing the right people together, and 1 + 1 = 10. And
See, I knew you were brilliant. We actually coined the term. We call it civic alchemy, but it's the same thing. Social alchemy, civic alchemy is sort of the sort of the program that I created at Schumacher to sort of as an umbrella for the things that I want to, that I'm pursuing, that don't kind of fall neatly into sort of one category. But I don't want to lose your point, Martin, because I think you're leading up to sort of my involvement with the New Alchemy Institute, which did come later, but not much later. It was almost by chance that I was visiting a friend, Susan Redlick, in the Department of Agriculture. I was teaching high school at the time, believe it or not, teaching high school in Cambridge. I borrowed a film from her, and as I was leaving her office, she gave me a job description. And it was for the New Alchemy Institute. Education director. New Alchemy, what she says, you should look into this. And so I had to go to the library, and I looked at these, got the New Alchemy journals, brought them home, my wife Debbie and others, and they looked at me and said, this looks like a commune. What is this? I mean, it was like so far outside anything that I had ever seen. But Susan, who knew me well, sort of intuited, you should think about this. So she gave me the description. Next thing I know, I'm going for the interview. It was like magical, right? I mean, get there on the 12 acres, and what do I see? A geodesic dome. I said, oh, okay, this is pretty neat. But in talking to them and going through the interview, there was a sense that it was more than technology, and it was more than organizing. They were trying to approach people and organizations and society in a very different way. They explained to me as I sat there, I'm looking at John Todd, PhD, and Bill McClarney, PhD, and these folks, wizards and all this stuff. And John was sort of, at that point, was becoming world known, renowned, right, for his work. And then they looked at me and said, okay, if you decide to do this, you come on and you're paid the same salary as everybody else. Same salary that John gets, same. And they said, wait a minute, no, you actually make it a little more because you have 2 children under the age of. So they had this system where if we hire you, you're part of the team. And there is no hierarchy here. Everybody plays, and that's the way the systems work, right? We all contribute to the integrity of the system, and that's how we're going to go about things. That's how we're going to approach the entire organization. So content sold me, but that also was just like a big plus in terms of people actually trying and experimenting with different ways of organizing themselves, right? It was created at a time where the Earth Days and others were pointing out the things that were wrong, the things that were a source of the problem: industrial agriculture, fossil fuel, energy. They used, I think, the phrase that was coined by Bucky and said, dare to be naive. It's one thing to talk about the problems, but what are the solutions? How do we create environmentally sound approaches to meeting our food, energy, and shelter needs? The naivete is we can do this, or we should accept this, right? We're going to do what nobody else is sort of like doing. Well, how do we even begin? And for John and Bill and Nancy, there was no question. We're going to look to nature. Nature's the model. So we're going to design systems based on nature's regenerative 3.84 billion year old strategy that has worked. We have a model. And the question is, are her approaches and strategies scalable? Usually, today, when you talk to an entrepreneur, you say scalable, you're saying scaling up. And we're saying, no, can we scale down? Can we get those big systems that are regenerative, but can we now fit them into a community?
That phrase, it could go on the door, about being naive and entering in a way of not knowing. I think another word that would fit the bill for me and knowing John and Nancy is humility. As opposed to hubris, because a PhD, super smart individual who had the humility to just enter in, kind of observing and paying attention and not assuming I know what I'm doing and I'm going to imply my will onto this situation. I'm going to listen and see what the situation is calling for and see if I can then be a participant. And I've seen the results of John's work in multiple countries around the world, including right here in the Hudson Valley in a couple of iterations. And he's maintained that humility all the way through to a point where probably some of our, good capitalist friends would be critical of him for not cashing in more on his
Well, I think you're absolutely right. No, you're absolutely right there. And they might also be critical because you also said something was very important here: listening. Humility, but also just honesty. We don't have all the answers, and we want to listen, and we want to watch, we want to observe, and we need to be willing to, I'll use the term, fail. Maybe it's not going to work, but in the whole scheme of things, in the systems sort of approach to things, in many cases, you learn a lot more from failure than you do some of the successes, because the successes basically reaffirm some of your assumptions, and the failures make you re-examine and maybe improve your model, right? To say, okay, there's a gap. And rather than try to bluff my way through, let me accept the fact that maybe my thinking is not as sound. And so what do I need to do? What's the missing piece? So I think that iterative process and that humility and that listening is not just listening to other people, but I think John and Bill and Nancy would also listening to the earth, right? Among other things, and hearing what kind of feedback you're getting there as well, or from nature.
We first met while you were at Dudley Street Initiative. Does that sound
I think you're
possible? Yes. We were at a workshop together at Schumacher, and actually you came here to Hawthorne Valley.
Absolutely.
On a tour.
I don't know that I actually had forgotten. No, you're right.
You made such an impression on me that I won't forget it. And it was a really positive and lasting impression. And I just remember also being so intrigued by Dudley Street, everything about it, including it was one of the first urban gardens in the country.
Well, I would say my nuance there, it was one of the first attempts at urban farming. Saying
farming.
the gardens were there, but this was an attempt to say, let's talk about urban agriculture. and get it, and the whole farming piece. And I was there for 4 years as director, and I didn't say it at the time, but because I couldn't afford to, but I should have paid them for the 4 years. I mean, it was like a postgraduate degree in communities and just life, to be honest with you. I mean, it was the most just enlightening experience that I've ever had, to be able to work with this community that defied conventional wisdom and how you go about developing and revitalizing a neighborhood. And to the credit of many people, potentially funders and all, that supported them and provided sort of the opportunity for this self-organizing neighborhood, for them to pull themselves out of the literal ashes that were created when things got so bad and arson for profit, when the community held up the urban renewal projects that the city had on the books. They were ready to come in and rebuild. They said, the community is beyond repair or reproach, so we've got to come in with our plan. And the neighborhood, particularly led by one woman in the beginning, Shay Madgen, but stood up to them when the city agreed that, okay, we need to rethink this and halt the slumlords and the folks who are sitting on the property waiting to reap the profits, right? When the city decided they were going to build marinas and then they said, we're going to just sit on the land, and when the city's ready to go, we're going to cash in. They panicked, and in an attempt to minimize their losses, they torched the buildings to collect insurance. And literally the neighborhood was burned to the ground. I mean, you could stand in the middle, do a 360 and not see much of anything standing. And the community convinced the powers that be, give us a chance to rebuild. The approach to the Dudley Street Neighborhood Initiative and planning was, we don't need experts to help us dream. We can dream and visualize how we want our community to develop. But we do need experts to help us realize the dream, right? So once we come up with the dream, we need help. We need lawyers. We need architects. We need these folks. And one of the lawyers said to them, you need the land. Go to the city of Boston and ask for the power of eminent domain over all abandoned vacant land in your neighborhood. Never been done by any grassroots community organization. As a matter of fact, many people in the neighborhood were nervous about accepting that kind of power. They said, well, this is what the developers come in and run people out of a neighborhood with this power of eminent domain. What makes you think we can do this wisely? And they set up a governance structure, elected board, 30 member. I was there for 4 years, 30-member board of directors, met the first Wednesday of every month. And in the 4 years that I was there was never a question of a quorum, because when they got that power of eminent domain, but then decided, let's turn this land into a community land trust. And they got control of a lot of land. It was an educational process. One of the most important lessons to say, as a community, we're not out to maximize the profit on resale of our homes. We want this because this is our source of wealth, but we want to cap it in a way that allows people to remain here. So they collectively made what I think most people would consider a sacrifice, right? This was their wealth building opportunity, but they said, we're going to use the community land trust to at least make sure that we give everybody an opportunity who wants to live here, that's been a part of this, to stay here. And so that, to me, you talk about a lesson, and you talk about how they use systems thinking. And by the way, we went to Jay Forrester, who was the father of systems thinking at MIT, and he met with us with our community group. We said, how do we do this? Can you help us figure out how do we avoid this conundrum or this dead end? So it was, as I say, a life's lesson for me. Unbelievable.
Well, it's a pattern that certainly needs to replicate now, because the challenges of displacement and what's happening, right around here in Columbia County, New York, with real estate, and I know it's happening everywhere, is one that needs to learn from new lessons and new patterns.
Especially since speculators now are going out and buying up single family homes, right?
Yeah.
And that's sort of the latest thing that's going on, and then just either renting them, right? But and that's what I kind of mean when I do say that as people change and come up with new solutions and really workable solutions, there's going to be a reaction, right?
Mhm.
How do we counter that and I'm talking from the pure perspective of maximizing greed or addressing greed, because that's the only way I can look at that.
I agree. And you said, this was their source of wealth, and yet they chose to cap it. And it was a sacrifice. And one can definitely see that. And I wonder what people sacrifice when their only definition of wealth is having more financial wealth.
Right.
And they lose out on all of the other forms of wealth that could nourish us
Absolutely.
as living human beings.
In the midst of all this, we were able to get a grant from the state. It was an environmental penalty grant, right? The oil companies for spilling oil had to pay a penalty. That went into a pot, and then that was redistributed to community groups that were looking to do, in most cases, sort of a restoration of a piece of land that was damaged by oil. Dudley Street on Brook Avenue had an old commercial garage that had been closed down that had leaked a bunch of oil into the ground. And when we got, I don't know, it was about $1.5 million to at least start the process of what we could do to redevelop that site, we realized it couldn't be agricultural land because of the oil, but we wound up building a 10,000 square foot greenhouse. And it thrives now, and it is it's just become sort of a place that solidified the identity of Dudley Street. What their model was in redevelopment was, we're creating an urban village. But that greenhouse, now farmers markets, and now they're about almost maybe, I think, an acre in actual outdoor agricultural production in lots around the community. And I'm just sort of bringing that up to say that agriculture has become sort of an integral part of their development, at both economic and beyond economic development piece. So they're a model in many cases for a lot of things, including housing and land management, self-governance, and urban agriculture, among others.
That's so heartening to hear, and nice to catch up on, because I remember being smitten by the whole story when I first met you. And of course, other people were paying attention because you went on to become the Secretary of Agriculture or Commissioner of Agriculture for the state of Massachusetts.
I always get ribbed by that when the secretaries of agriculture in Texas and California would look at me and say, "We got elected, you got appointed." I said, okay, yeah, you're right.
Well, you were appointed by, I believe, 3 administrations, including two Democratic and 1 Republican.
I was appointed by Mike Dukakis.
Yeah.
And just as he appointed me, and I was finishing out the term of my dear friend, departed friend, Gus Schumacher. I don't know if you ever got a chance to meet Gus, but anyway, Gus Schumacher had to leave and return to his job at the World Bank. I said, so I'm coming in. And so Mike Dukakis appointed me, and he said, "I can't believe I'm appointing this Black kid from Cleveland, Ohio, who's working at the New Alchemy Institute to become Commissioner of Agriculture." And when he offered it, I said, "Well, I got to make a few calls before I can even accept it." And I called Fred Winthrop, the former Commissioner of Agriculture that I worked with in organizing farmers markets a while back, and a few other people. But the last call I made was to the director of the Massachusetts Farm Bureau. And I said, I got to do this, because I think I don't know that how they're going to feel about this, because, it's a tight, agriculture, tight-knit community. And Gordon Price, I'll never forget, I got on the phone, we talked, and he said, "You know what? You've been at this place, New Alchemy Institute. You did a lot of work with the cranberry growers on integrated pest management." And he said, that was important. He goes, "We know we've got to start reconciling our activities with the environmental community, and we don't know how to do that. And you've been involved with the farmers markets and the gardening and now New Alchemy. So you understand agriculture, you understand the environment. So I'm going to support you. You got to help us." And so, to me, that was like, I was floored, right? That they were realizing that they had to better understand. Then his final word to me was, "Just explain one thing to me, Greg." He says, "Sustainable, is that necessarily organic?" And I said, "Gordon, let me just say this. If we could work with the farmers and the universities, and we could demonstrate in a controlled way that how much of those chemical pesticides that are, okay, you admit harmful to the environment, but also costly. Start cutting back without threatening or compromising the yields of farmers. Would you be willing to? You said, yeah, we're all for that. If we could cut our costs and also do that without jeopardizing our yields. So that's how you got to do it. We need to work with the universities who can demonstrate, right? How much do you can you wean yourself, and then maybe you get to zero, but maybe you get somewhere in between, but let's use that as an overall approach. And he was on board.
Amazing. And then you stayed on when Bill Weld became governor? Or?
I stayed on, and it was because of the Massachusetts dairy farmers. Gordon Price, the director of the Farm Bureau, said, I'm going to put you on the circuit of every regional Farm Bureau meeting, being the keynoter. He said, just tell them what you would do. I will let you make your pitch to them for if you want to stay on, why you just stay on. So I did that. And then after that, dairy farmers approached me. And they asked if I would meet with them. They explained to me their predicament with price. They were going out of business. It was impossible. They were sort of strapped to this federal milk marketing order where the feds determine how much milk price you can price your milk based on. Had nothing to do with the cost of production in Massachusetts. I basically went out to meet with them. We sat around the table. The first question they asked me is that, so Commissioner, what do you know about dairy? And I looked at all of them. And in 2 seconds, I said, nothing. And then there was this silence. And then all of a sudden, Gordy Cook smiled, big grin. He goes, great. Will you listen to us? We're in trouble. We actually have some ideas that we think could help, but we need the support of the commissioner. Would you listen? Listen. We they actually had a very good idea. We tried to put it in place. It survived in Massachusetts. Believe it or not, it was challenged by the milk dealers all the way to the U.S. Supreme Court, and we lost. They were disappointed, but they also realized, wait a minute, we organized. We had a voice that got us all the way to the Supreme Court. People listened to what we were doing. That was one of those important lessons about organizing, networking, coming sort of this full circle. Dairy farmers are, I consider, among the hardest working people I've ever seen in my life, right?
No
the cow's got to
question.
be milked, and you can say whatever you want to about milk or whatever, but they got to do this. And they're sort of isolated, right? I mean, they work hard. And even John Gerber at the University of Massachusetts said they don't usually come together and organize, but they did. And I think that was one of the most powerful lessons, even though we sort of lost the war. I think there were the battle and the accomplishment of that synergy of organizing really came through.
You and I had, or I would say I had the good fortune of being on a learning journey with you to Cuba in 2014 to look at agroecological systems in Cuba. And after that, you formed the Cuba-US Agroecology Network. And what are the lessons you think we can learn from what we observed in Cuba?
The loss of a source of petroleum for all things, right? That left this country sort of in a predicament, but particularly their agriculture, and that they were, going through, as that stage where people losing 15, 20 pounds, right? Because they just weren't eating it. And the charge was find a way for us to feed our people without chemicals. This initiative, not driven by ideology, not driven by protesting something, but out of necessity, life and death. So what are our options? I think you observed the comprehensiveness of how they went about doing it. I mean, all the things that we were doing, sort of, maybe this organization was doing permaculture, you're doing aquaculture, New Alchemy did a bunch of it together, but didn't put it all together, right? And not just all together, but all together in a life and death situation. And that was the result. It was agroecology. Out of that necessity came sort of a advocacy. There were people who went back to chemicals if they could. They were always the outliers. But for the most part, it was sort of the advocacy as a result of practice. They understood this works and it's healthy, and they became, as a matter of fact, one of the years, and I forget I think it was the World Wildlife Fund declared that Cuba was probably one of the only sustainable economies in the world, and they weren't, and that's not to say there was room for all sorts of improvements, as you and I, and people were concerned about the nature of the overall economy. But I also sensed, and this may just be me, and so it was Travis as well, we talked about a lot, but there was sort of a sense of solidarity. I mean, you could kind of feel it. It was palpable that we're in this and we would love to be able to come out of this, but there was a sense that let's come out of this together. So there were just all those lessons for me that were incredible. And to be able to experience that with my son, Travis on the trip, that was amazing.
And it speaks to healthy systems and the fact that relationships and networks are so fundamental to healthy systems. And you have been so influential and instrumental in so many future-bearing, life-nourishing initiatives. And I'm just curious, you've given so much to that, and I think there has to be some reciprocity, hopefully. What has nourished you out of all, or how have these relationships nourished you?
Yeah, it's a good question. I would say that they have made me realize that basically, even more than an organizer, what I am is a lifelong student. And how little I really knew and understood about things. I mean, it's one thing to sort of read about and see a Dudley Street Neighborhood Initiative. They were here and then they were here. But most of my experiences, I've sort of had to be in the in-between. And one of the things, for instance, that the Dudley Street neighborhood residents said to me was at the premiere of a film called Holding Ground that was aired in their community, really wonderful documentary. But they came out, many of them were crying. And they said, most people don't know how hard it was. It was really hard. And that was sort of one of that, and probably same thing with the dairy farmers, is that they really were struggling and the community was struggling, but they had a vision. And I think that was a part that's important. They were here, but they had a vision of how to bring themselves out of it. And they were willing to commit themselves working together to realize that. And I think that was, whether it was the dairy farmers of Boston Urban Gardeners, Dudley Street, one of the keys that I learned about organizing was, is there a shared vision? And if not, how do you bring about that? What's the process? And we kind of like one of the things we worked on, a process that, once again, we don't need the experts, but we're also, as you kind of mentioned before, we're also in disagreement among ourselves. So is there a way for us to sort of sift through that and to have a shared vision emerge? And that is sort of like what attracted me to the World Game workshop. My colleague Elizabeth Thompson and myself were given the opportunity to steward, I guess the word I have to use, the workshop, which Bucky created as a response to war games. It was a direct response to war games, where he said military strategists have a perspective of the entire world. They've got information, data on trends, data on technology, data on resources, and they use that comprehensive inventory of resources to figure out how to kill each other. And his idea was, wait, what if, because it's important, and he looked at the whole earth, there are a number of things that he observed. The 92 regenerative elements, that is nature's minimum inventory, maximum diversity toolkit. Everything in the world, everything in the universe, right? That you can feel, that you can smell, that you can touch, that you can see, is made from some one or combination of those elements. That's pretty amazing. The periodic table is it. That's what we have to work with. But then he said, but if you look at the earth, those elements and minerals are unevenly distributed around the world. And so, as we know, he says, and so when you think about wars usually come about because diamonds, gold, silver, oil, natural gas, this is where the resources that we all need to build our economies and to create prosperity. But you've got that and I don't have it, and I'm going to take it from you. Or what's happening now is you can see how that's progressed. And even now it's an issue with renewable energy, right? Because it's one thing to talk about having the wind and solar resources enough to power the entire world with renewables and clean energy. But the energy resource is only part of the story, because you've got to convert the wind and solar into electricity. And that takes wind turbines and solar panels, and that takes resources. That takes, right? Aluminum, it takes steel, it takes cobalt, it takes lithium. And so we are still challenged with, can we actually do this and do it in a sustainable way? The World Game workshop that Elizabeth and I are working on is introducing now some of the concepts. We're talking about the need, sit down here, you are sitting down, for a global grid, a globally interconnected electric grid, because that's the way that you can accommodate the intermittency of solar and wind, right? It's sunny here, but I've got the wind, and I did a lot of work with wind energy. The wind turbines, a lot of them, they mostly operate at night when the winds pick up, the wind's strong, but there's no demand, and that because it's night, right? And everybody's asleep. But there's a demand over here in a different time zone. And the question is, do we now have the technical capability to transmit the electricity generated here to here without losing it? And is it economical? And we do. And this is what Bucky intuited a long time ago. It says, once we can transcend the Bering Strait, we will literally be able to connect the entire world via Russia and the United States, ironically enough, right? By doing that. And so here is this idea that sounds like really wild, but it is one that I think is absolutely imperative if we're going to actually create a renewable world. But what that also means, borrowing from Schumacher and others, is that concepts like a resource commons, the resources now shouldn't be owned by one country. It's got to be, this is a commons for the world. We've got to figure out new structures, new ways to approach this, how to generate what Bucky sort of said would be spontaneous cooperation. But that spontaneous cooperation towards a world grid is already underway. The concept is regional grid integration. So you're now finding neighboring countries to say, wait, you've got that, and they're on their own starting to build and integrate their grids. It is a form of spontaneous cooperation. I started exploring this, and Europe, parts of Africa, but all of Central America, their grids are all interconnected. With the only country that's not part of that is Belize, but they are doing it because it makes sense. And as a result, it's also creating new forms of cooperation. Conflicts, wars are very noisy. They're very visible. People know when there's a war going on, at least most of it, right? Cooperation is quiet. It's silent. And if you're not looking for it, you may not see it. And I think that's a missed opportunity. So one of the things that we're doing with the World Game Workshop is making the invisible cooperation visible and saying to folks, we're already taking significant steps towards this creation, self-organizing world grid that most people think, well, how are you going to do that? Are you starting from whole cloth? No, we're really along the way, and it's been sort of this silent revolution. So it does tie a bunch of things together. For me, it's a culmination of a lot of the work, and it allows me to actually help perpetuate one of Bucky's, I think, important legacies, and that is the world game.
When a lot of people talk about, going solar, going renewable, and they talk about going off grid, and my response to that intuitively has always been, but the grid is actually such an opportunity for a social experiment amongst people and now amongst countries. And so I'm really happy to hear you.
Well, and I will say this is interesting because and it's also a bit of a geopolitical dilemma, because the country that's taken this under their wing and really promoting the world grid is China. It's called the Global Energy Interconnection. They're researching it. They're looking at all the critical sort of technical and sort of regulatory issues that have to be addressed if you're going to do this in a big way. The last piece of this that's important is that being off grid or microgrids, they are actually integrated into the world grid sort of structure. So you can actually, because it's sort of a modular sort of piece, your microgrid can be a part of the world grid, and you can decide, well, not now. Now I'd like to, and it's compatible with that. And so to an extent, it is this thinking globally, acting locally again. Mm-hmm. What's the integration of the global and the local in a way that is, I think the term that I read in the New York Times, globalism as opposed to globalization. Globalization is global competition. Globalism is global cooperation. And we're seeing that cooperation happening between nations and countries to achieve these goals, like greenhouse gas emissions goals that the Netherlands says, boy, we can't do it alone. And if every country tries to go it alone, we're going to dig up every ounce of lithium, cobalt. We're going to dig up the world if every country tries to meet that. If we pull together and on a global scale understand how to do more with less, we can achieve the goals. But otherwise, we're going to find ourselves fighting over who controls the lithium, the cobalt, the aluminum, the steel, right? These are hard things. I'm going to say there's hardware that has to happen to make this all work.
Well, I am so grateful for the insight and the hope-giving work that you're doing and the commitment towards realizing a truly just and sustainable world. And I'm just so glad I know you, and I look forward to our paths crossing in person soon. Hopefully.
We're going to do that. We're going to do that real soon. And I agree. I don't believe in coincidences. And I have to say, Place Core, all these things that you're involved with that they're just all part of this thing, which what we've got to do now is make these things seamless, right? I mean, you see it. I mean, John and Nancy and Bill and those folks. So I am optimistic. And, I will say that, I hate to keep quoting, but he influenced my life. But Bucky said, optimism is knowing that you have choices. We do have options. We can do this, but it means it will take courage, right? To stand up and say, here's what you're because the first thing you're going to hear, you're crazy. No way we're going to build a world grid. It's not going to, what about security? They'll find every reason to say why it can't work. And Yep, you're right. And I'm loving that. Tell me all the reasons it can't work, because we need to hear that, because we need to make sure that those things are addressed, right? So it's an exciting time, and I appreciate your commitment to this. My commitment still is driven primarily for grandkids. I mean, that's my mantra. You got two, yeah. Three. All right. See here. Okay. You got one more to catch up, but it's an important, and I think we're blessed to be able to do, well, we're blessed to be able to do it, but then again, we've chosen to do it, right? So I think that's a big deal.
Thank you for bringing courage into it. The heart, which your heart forces are really a gift to the world, Greg. Thank you so much.
Thank you. I'm looking forward to many, many more conversations.
If you'd like to learn more about Greg's work and the Schumacher Center for New Economics, visit centerforneweconomics.org. For more information on the World Game Workshop, visit worldgameworkshop.org. Thanks for listening to Hawthorne Valley's Roots to Renewal podcast. We are an association comprised of a variety of interconnected initiatives that work collectively to meet our mission. You can learn more about our work by visiting our website at hawthornevalley.org. Hawthorne Valley is a registered 501c3 nonprofit organization, and we rely on the generosity of people like you to make our work a reality. Please consider making a donation to support us today. If you'd like to help us in other ways, please help spread the word about this podcast by sharing it with your friends and leaving us a rating and review. Special thanks to our sponsor, Tierra Farm, who makes this podcast possible. Thank you to Grammy Award-winning artist Aaron Dessner for providing our soundtrack, and Aaron Ping for his editing expertise.